Welcome back to The Explainer, everyone. Today, we're unpacking one of the most fascinating and honestly contradictory figures of the 20th century, Reza Shah Pahlavi. We are going to explore a massive, tragic historical irony. I mean, think about it. Here's a guy who started out as a semi-illiterate soldier and somehow ended up building Iran's strongest, most centralized state in 2,000 years. Yet, for all that iron-fisted strength, as you'll see today, that very same state collapsed in a matter of mere weeks. Okay, let's just dive right into the structure for today. First, the 1921 Cossack coup. Then, we'll look at the pillars of the Pahlavi state, followed by forced modernization. From there, we'll cover crushing tribes and traditions, alienating the nation, and wrap up with his sudden 1941 fall.
All right, part one, the 1921 Cossack coup.
To really understand the rise of Reza Shah, we have to put ourselves in the incredibly chaotic environment of Iran in 1921. The ruling Qajar dynasty, weak and basically bankrupt. The whole country had been ravaged by the fallout and the famine of World War I. Plus, you had this very real, looming threat of Bolshevism spilling over the northern border from the newly formed Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the British are desperate to secure their oil interests and create a buffer zone, so they're actively looking for a strongman to bring some order to this fractured nation. The stage was literally perfectly set for a military takeover, and that strongman ended up coming from the Cossack Brigade. Reza Khan, as he was known back then, had risen through the ranks of this modernized elite cavalry unit. In fact, on February 21, 1921, utilizing this exact military background, he marched on Tehran. And he did it with a shockingly small force, just 3,000 men and 18 machine guns against the nation of millions. The sheer audacity of it caught the crumbling establishment entirely off guard. People even started calling him Reza Khan Maxim, because he relied so heavily on the Maxim machine gun to project this outsized power.
From that bloodless coup, his ascent was rapid. Methodically brilliant. He systematically cultivated this myth of being the sole national savior. By May 1921, he's appointed Minister of War, where he consolidates all these fractured military forces under his absolute command. By October 1923, he becomes Prime Minister. And finally, after crushing a bunch of internal rebellions and intimidating his political base, a compliant parliament, the Majlis, formally abolishes the centuries-old Qajar dynasty in October 1925. 2 months later, he is crowned Reza Shah Pahlavi.
Notice the visual messaging in this 1926 coronation stamp. He is clearly transitioning from a rough cavalry officer to an emperor claiming total, absolute authority. Rumor has it that at his coronation, he flat out refused to let a cleric place the crown on his head. He took it in his own hands instead, kind of like his hero Napoleon. He was sending a loud, undeniable message to his subjects and the world. I am the sole architect of my own power.
Let's move to part two, pillars of the Pahlavi state.
So how exactly did he maintain this absolute power? Well, Reza Shah was obsessed with order, discipline, and centralized control. He basically built two massive institutional pillars to hold up his throne. The historian Ervand Abramian provides some incredible data that illustrates this perfectly. In 1921, the Iranian military was roughly 22,000 fractured, poorly trained troops, and the bureaucracy was just a haphazard collection of local civil servants. By 1941, the military had exploded to 127,000 troops. That's nearly a six-fold increase, and the civil service grew 17-fold to 90,000 employees. This massive expansion was largely fueled by a sweeping 1925 mandatory military conscription law, which basically dragged young men from isolated villages and drafted them into a unified, rigidly controlled national system.
Abrahamian notes, and I quote, "A more apt comparison would be with the Tudors, early Bourbons, or 16th century Habsburgs, monarchs whose goal had been to create centralized states. So he wasn't just your standard 20th century dictator, he was a foundational state builder. His goal wasn't just to rule the existing chaos, it was to build a centralized state totally from scratch, crushing all internal opposition from the left, the right, and the center to permanently enforce his will." Now, to fund this massive modernizing military and bureaucracy, the regime practiced something called étatisme, which is basically sweeping, centralized state control of the economy. Reza Shah ousted foreign financial administrators and imposed these heavy, regressive state monopolies on everyday consumer goods. Things ordinary people relied on, like sugar, tea, and tobacco, were suddenly heavily taxed. This pumped massive revenues straight into the central government's coffers, but it drastically raised the cost of living for the poorest Iranians. It created this deep undercurrent of silent, desperate resentment, which was only kept in check by severe state censorship and a total lack of a free press.
Which brings us to part three, forced modernization and infrastructure.
So what were these grand ambitions he was funding? Reza Shah wanted an infrastructure and educational revolution that would forcibly drag Iran into the modern age, whether the population was ready for it or not. 10.1 billion riyals. Let that number sink in for a second. That is equivalent to about 500 million US dollars at the time, and it was the final cost of his absolute crowning achievement, the Trans-Iranian Railway. It was an undeniable engineering marvel for sure, but remember, it was financed almost entirely by those regressive taxes on sugar and tea that hit the poorest, rural, and working-class Iranians the absolute hardest.
And when you look at the map of early Pahlavi development here, you can see how this railway cuts straight through the formidable, rugged terrain of the Alborz and Zagros Mountains. The historian Abbas Zamanat makes a really critical observation about this route. This railway didn't connect the major commercial cities of the interior to boost domestic trade or help out local merchants. Nope. A north-to-south line was prioritized for strict state control, for rapid troop movement to crush provincial rebellions, and, notably, to connect the capital directly to the Shah's massive private estates in the lush northern province of Mazandaran.
Moving on to Part 4, Crushing Tribes and Traditions.
This leads us to a really fascinating dialectical contrast. We have to ask, at whose expense did this forced modernization actually come? Because to build his uniform modern nation, Reza Shah violently dismantled the old one. Historian Nikki Keddy masterfully explains this as the creation of two cultures. On one hand, modernization achieved a new national public school system, secular courts, and a unified, educated urban identity. But in stark contrast, deeply rooted traditions were utterly destroyed. The Shah used his new standing army to bomb and disarm autonomous nomadic tribes, enforcing these brutal tribal sedentarization policies. Nomads were literally forced into farming in model villages where their livestock died en masse. This plunged a huge portion of the rural majority into mass starvation and deep, inescapable poverty.
And this cultural assault wasn't just limited to rural tribes. The regime rigidly mandated Western dress codes across the entire society. Men were forced to wear the Pahlavi cap and later the European fedora. But most traumatically, the regime targeted the chador, the traditional full-body veil worn by many Iranian women. In the mid-1930s, police were actually ordered to physically tear veils off women in the streets. I mean, think about how profoundly violating that is. It ripped people from their traditional identities, forced many women into permanent house arrest just out of sheer shame, and deeply marginalized the traditional Shi'i ulama, the clergy. He was enforcing a state-mandated secular uniformity at the end of a baton.
Part 5, Alienating the Nation.
As you can probably guess, these oppressive policies, while building a shiny, modern institutional facade, created a bubbling cauldron of widespread domestic resentment across virtually all social classes. Reza Shah created an atmosphere of absolute, suffocating terror. The Majlis, the parliament, became a mere rubber stamp, where he handpicked every single deputy. Intellectuals and even his closest aristocratic allies, like his powerful court minister Taimurtash or the bold cleric Madarez, were suddenly thrown in prison and quietly murdered by prison doctors or starved in their cells. Meanwhile, he forced local landowners to just hand over their ancestral estates. He ruthlessly built a personal fortune of roughly £3 million, becoming the absolute largest landowner in the entire Middle East.
This cultural alienation is brilliantly illustrated by the state propaganda of the time. Look at the pre-Islamic Sasanian imagery on this postage stamp. The Shah was deliberately cultivating a hyper-secular, ancient Persian nationalism to bypass and explicitly undermine Islamic traditions and authority. He was actively trying to replace the centuries-old religious foundations of society with absolute loyalty only to the state, the flag, and, well, above all, himself.
As Abbas Zamanat argues, and I think this is crucial, quote, the secularizing agenda further eroded an ancient social accord that tied, at least in theory, the good government with the good religion. By aggressively severing this tie, Reza Shah deeply alienated the ulama, the traditional bazaar merchant classes, and the massive rural majority. He built a remarkably modern state structure, absolutely, but he entirely hollowed out the social and moral foundation right beneath it.
And that hollow foundation sets the stage for our final chapter, Part 6, the sudden 1941 fall.
So this brings us to the critical historical question for you all to ponder today. How does a state that was strong enough to forcibly remake society, to crush centuries-old tribal confederacies, and to build massive, unprecedented infrastructure, just completely disintegrate in a matter of weeks?
Well, the answer lies in the very nature of his authoritarian rule. In 1941, amidst World War II, the British and Soviets demanded access to his prized Trans-Iranian Railway to supply the Red Army against Nazi Germany. Reza Shah stalled, citing neutrality, so the Allies swiftly invaded. And that massive 127,000-strong army we talked about earlier, it was built and trained exclusively for pacifying lightly armed domestic tribes, not for fighting global mechanized empires. It crumbled almost instantly under fire. And most tellingly, because he had terrorized, taxed, and deeply alienated his own people for 2 decades, the Iranian public watched the invasion and his subsequent forced abdication to the British with total apathy. Out of millions of citizens, literally no one lifted a single finger to defend the dictator.
And that is the ultimate tragic irony of the Reza Shah era. A modern state built purely by an iron fist collapsed the very moment it faced an external anvil. He left behind a modernized, centralized administration, a formidable standing army, and a brand new educational system, sure, but he also left behind a deeply fractured, traumatized society that had lost its cultural moorings. As you evaluate his complex legacy, ask yourselves, were the undeniable historic achievements of forced modernization truly worth the devastating price of absolute dictatorship? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning history.